Montana Territory, June 1882. It was a hard wind that drove across the plains that morning, the kind that carried dust and memory both. When Georgia Calloway stepped off the stagecoach in Dry Creek with nothing but a stitched leather bag and 2 children pressed close to her sides. Her dress was plain, a muted blue faded from years of washing, and her eyes had the look of someone who no longer expected anything good to stay. She kept her shoulders square, though her chin lifted. The little boy beside her, Wyatt, clutched her hand tightly. His younger sister, Willa, leaned into their mother's side, tired and quiet. Both had their mother's dark hair and wary eyes. The town was small, built tight around a single dirt street and a few weathered buildings. It smelled of horses, old wood, and the lingering smoke of breakfast fires. Georgia's boots hit the ground and stayed there. She had nowhere else to go. She paid the driver, thanked him without smiling, then turned to the children. "We do not look back," she said softly. "Only ahead." They nodded, trusting her because she was all they had. She had written ahead to take a job as a seamstress in the general store. It was not much, but it would keep her and the children fed. After what her husband had done, leaving without a word, vanishing into the wild with someone else's promises, Georgia had stopped believing in most things, especially love. She was not looking for help. She was not looking for anyone, which was why she stiffened when a man on horseback drew up beside them, reining in a tall roan with a gentle hand. He wore a dusted black hat low, and his coat was the kind worn by men who rode long and slept outside more often than not. He dismounted slow, careful not to startle the children. "You Georgia Calloway?" he asked, voice low and even. Georgia nodded once. "Who's asking?" "Clayton Archer," he said, taking off his hat. His hair was dark like hers but a little longer, and his eyes were sharp, green, and steady. "Mrs. Howard asked me to meet you. She's down with sickness. Said you were arriving today." George's shoulders eased just a little. "I see. She wanted to make sure you and your children got settled all right. I've got a wagon waiting." Georgia looked up at him, then at her children, then back again. "We can walk." Clayton did not argue, just dipped his head and said, "Then I'll walk you." He took Wyatt's other hand without asking and did not flinch when the boy gripped tight. Willa peeked up at him, curious. Georgia watched, cautious, but said nothing. It was a short walk to the boarding house. The rooms were clean and quiet, the landlady kind, and by evening Georgia had unpacked what little they had. She sat on the edge of the bed, watching her children sleep, thinking about how far they had come from Missouri, how the train ride had rattled her bones, how she had sworn she would never trust another man again. Downstairs, someone knocked at the kitchen door. She opened it to find Clayton standing there with a sack of apples and a small tin of honey. He cleared his throat. Figured the kids might appreciate something sweet. Georgia looked at him, long and quiet. "Why are you helping?" He shrugged. "Maybe I just do not like to see good folks struggle alone." She took the apples. "We will be fine." "I believe that," he said, meeting her eyes. "But fine ain't the same as welcome." She shut the door gently. The next day, she started work at the general store. It was long hours and sore fingers, but honest. Clayton came in sometimes, quiet and respectful, buying supplies or talking with the owner. He never lingered, never pushed. But when Wyatt tripped in the street one afternoon, it was Clayton who lifted him up and dabbed the scraped knee with his own kerchief. Georgia saw. She said nothing. Weeks passed. The children grew steadier. Wyatt started helping at the livery, brushing horses. Willa followed Georgia like a shadow, always watching. And slowly, piece by piece, Georgia began to breathe easier. Not trust, but breathe. One evening, after supper, she found Clayton waiting outside the store. He nodded toward the edge of town. "There's a place. Good for watching the sunset. You and the kids might like it." She hesitated. Why? He looked at her plain. Because you deserve something quiet. And they deserve to see their mother smile. She studied him. I do not trust kind men anymore. He nodded once. Then do not trust kindness. Her brow lifted. He stepped closer, voice low. Then trust me instead. George's breath caught, just for a second. She did not say yes. But that night, she walked with him and the children to the ridge. They sat on a fallen log, watched the sky bleed orange and gold. Willa leaned against Clayton's side by the end, half asleep. Wyatt asked him questions about horses, and Clayton answered every one. Georgia watched them all. Something in her chest loosening, unfamiliar and warm. She did not trust love. But Clayton did not ask for that. Not yet. Only trust. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The dry heat settled different by late July, thick in the hollows between the hills and clinging to the skin like a second shirt. Georgia stitched through it anyway, bent over the counter in the back room of the general store with a half-mended pair of trousers and sweat gathering at her temples. The window beside her was cracked just enough to let in the smell of sun-warmed sage, and outside, hoofbeats passed now and then, steady and unhurried. A bell rang up front. She didn't look up. I brought that canvas bolt you were a skin after, came Clayton's voice, calm and low. She glanced toward the doorway. That was a week ago. Had to come from Helena. Freight took longer than expected. He leaned against the doorframe, holding the parcel. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbow, forearms tanned and dusted from the road. He didn't shift his weight or push for more. Georgia stood, wiped her palms on her apron, and took the bolt from him. I can't pay for it till next week. I know. He tipped his hat back a fraction. Ain't worried. He didn't offer to gift it. Didn't make it into charity. Just a transaction delayed, and somehow that settled something unspoken between them. Georgia set the cloth aside. The tailor in town doesn't like me taking his work. He's not the one feeding two mouths with his hands, Clayton said, gaze steady. You are. She studied him, then turned back to her table. Wyatt's been rising earlier than me. He swept the front porch this morning before I came down. Boys learning to carry weight early. He doesn't have a choice. Clayton crossed the room, slow. Neither did I, far as I remember. She looked up. You don't talk much about yourself. Not much to tell. Try me. He hesitated, then pulled out a chair and sat, hands resting on his knees. My pa was a logger out near the Bitterroots. Worked himself to the bone. Died under a felled pine when I was 16. Left me with a mother too sick to stand and two younger brothers. Georgia didn't interrupt. I sold the team, got work where I could. Mostly fence building and hauling freight. Boys got grown, left for Spokane. Ma passed some winters back. Since then, it's just been the land and the road. You don't have a wife in some other town? No, you ever did? No, she threaded her needle again. I was married 12 years. He left before Willa turned 3. Took what money we had and never sent word. Clayton didn't look away. You waited for news? Too long. He nodded once. Quiet. Outside, a wagon rattled past, the driver humming something low and tuneless. Georgia folded the trousers, set them aside. You fix fences? Among other things. My back gate's sagging. If you've got the time. I've got it. They walked together to the boarding house just before dusk, Wyatt trotting ahead with a length of twine, Willa holding a small tin pail with bent nails. The gate leaned inward. One hinge rusted through. Clayton crouched, examining it with practiced eyes. You'll need a new board here, he said, and the top hinge reset. I can help, Wyatt offered, already pulling at the latch. You hold the nails, Clayton told him. That's the most important job. While he worked, Georgia sat on the back step, smoothing Willa's hair where it curled at her neck. The girl leaned into her without a word, thumb tucked under her chin. The air smelled of chamomile and earth. "You ever think of leaving?" Georgia asked, voice low. "Sometimes," Clayton replied, adjusting the hinge. "But I've started sleeping easier here. You don't strike me as someone who sleeps easy." "Not until lately." She looked up, met his eyes. "And what changed?" "Some people walk into your life quiet," he said, not looking away. "Then you realize you stopped waiting for the next thing to go wrong." Georgia held the gaze, something fragile flickering in her chest. The gate swung true on its new hinge. Wyatt grinned. "It works." Clayton stood, brushing dust from his knees. "Let me know if the barn door ever gives you trouble." Georgia nodded. "I will." He tipped his hat, then turned toward the road. But before he reached it, Willa called out behind him. "Mr. Archer?" He turned. She held out a small yellow bloom, picked from the yard. "You forgot your flower." He crouched, accepted it with a soft smile. "Thank you kindly, Miss Willa." Georgia watched him walk away, the flower tucked near his collar. She didn't say the feeling rising in her was hope. But that night, when the children were asleep and the house quiet, she stood by the window for a long time, watching the road where he'd disappeared from view. And she didn't feel alone. Not quite. By early August, the cottonwoods along the creek had thickened into full shade, and the mountains beyond Dry Creek glowed pale against the sky each morning. Georgia took in sewing from 3 households, now one a ranchwoman whose husband had broken his collarbone, another a schoolteacher with narrow shoulders and too many mended cuffs, and a traveling preacher's wife who'd brought a bundle of linens spotted with old mildew and hope. The work kept her steady. Her hands knew the rhythm of needle and thread better than they knew rest. She stitched until her back ached, then stitched a little longer. She didn't speak much unless spoken to. Clayton came by less often now, though when he did, Wyatt always found something to ask him. Willa, too, had taken to watching the road in the late afternoons. One morning, Georgia was kneeling by the hearth in the boarding house kitchen, scraping the bottom of the coffee pot, when the landlady stepped in from the rear door with a folded note and a faint sheen of worry on her brow. "From the livery," she said. "Boy ran it over." Georgia wiped her hands and opened the paper. Her jaw tightened. "What's wrong?" the landlady asked. "Wyatt's thumb got smashed under a hoof," Georgia said. "They've sent for the doctor." She left her apron behind and walked fast down the road, the sun high and unrelenting. At the livery, she found Wyatt sitting on an overturned bucket with a rag tied around his hand, his face pale and trying hard not to cry. His boots didn't quite touch the ground. Clayton was crouched beside him, sleeves rolled, his own fingers wrapped around Wyatt's wrist to keep it still. "They said he tried to tighten a cinch before the horse was calm," Clayton said without looking up. "He's brave, this one." Georgia crouched in front of her son. "Let me see." Wyatt's lower lip trembled, but he held out his hand. The thumb was swollen and darkening, the nail split down the center. "Doc says it'll heal," Clayton added, finally meeting her eyes. "No break, just blood and time." Georgia nodded, but her voice came out low. "You should have been watching him closer." "I was at the corral," Clayton said. He was helping the stable hand. He wanted to prove he could handle things. Wyatt's eyes filled. "I didn't mean to mess up." Georgia looked at him, at the bandaged hand and the way he grit his teeth like he thought he had to. Then she looked back at Clayton. "He can't afford to get hurt," she said quietly. "None of us can." Clayton stood. "Then teach him how, Georgia. Not how to stay small, but how to be strong without breaking himself." She didn't answer. That evening, Clayton knocked on the back door with a satchel slung over one shoulder and asked Wyatt if he'd like to learn how to treat leather. They sat on the porch together while Georgia peeled potatoes inside. Willa played with a stick and a smooth stone, drawing loops in the dirt. Clayton showed Wyatt how to oil a saddle strap, how to test the stitching for weakness. Wyatt barely blinked the entire time. Georgia watched through the window. Later, after the children had gone to bed, she stepped out into the dark. The sky was clear, the air cooler. She found Clayton leaning against the porch rail, looking out toward where the hills met the stars. "You didn't have to stay," she said. "I know." She folded her arms. "He needs a man to follow, but I don't want him hurt trying. He's a boy learning what to stand on," Clayton said. "Pain's part of it. But so's knowing someone's nearby when he falls." She exhaled, slow. "I don't know how to let people stay." He didn't turn. "I won't ask you to." Silence stretched between them. "But I'd like to keep showing up," he added. "Not because you need it, because I want to." Georgia leaned against the rail a few feet from him. "Willa asked if you were family. What did you tell her?" "That I didn't know yet." Clayton looked at her then. The corners of his eyes lined in a way that spoke of long years and little ease. "I'm not after a place that isn't offered," he said. "But I've been thinking when I ride out it doesn't sit right anymore. Like I've left something worth staying for." Georgia looked down at her hands. "I never learned what to do with peace. When it comes, I hold it too tight, and it slips." Clayton's voice was quiet. "Then let it rest beside you. It doesn't always need to be held." She didn't reply, but she didn't move away either. When he left, he didn't say goodnight, just tipped his hat and walked into the dark. Georgia stood on the porch long after he was gone, cool night wind brushing against her cheeks, the weight of the day finally easing from her shoulders. She didn't trust love, but she didn't feel alone, and that, for the first time in years, felt like something solid under her feet. The first frost came early that year. It crept in before the cottonwoods had fully turned, catching the town by surprise with silver-edged fences and breath pluming in the morning air. Georgia tugged the children's blankets higher each night and boiled root vegetables with salt and lard, stretching what she had while the season shifted hard and fast. The general store grew quieter as folks started preparing for winter. Woodpiles rose higher behind houses, and the town blacksmith took on more work, hammering out snow cleats and mending sled runners. Georgia mended what she could for trade mittens from worn trousers, a quilt patchwork tied with uneven thread, and kept her coins stored in a rusted tin beneath the floorboard of her room. One afternoon, Mrs. Howard returned to her post at the shop. Her cough remained, but she was upright again, and with her back came the offer that Georgia could cut her hours if she needed to. Georgia declined without pause. She wanted the work, needed it truthfully. "You don't stop," Mrs. Howard said, watching her pin a collar to a dress form. "I don't know how," Georgia replied, not looking up. She saw Clayton again that evening, just as the sun was lowering behind the ridge. He rode up slow, his horse lathered from a long ride, and dismounted without hurry. His coat was heavier now, lined with rough wool, and a narrow scar traced along his jaw she hadn't noticed before. "I was up near Flathead Lake," he said, tying off the reins, "helping a rancher clear out a broken dam. Took longer than I planned." Georgia set her mending basket down on the stoop. "I thought maybe you'd gone for good." "I thought about it," he said. "Didn't sit right." She didn't answer. Willa was inside, humming to herself while she arranged buttons by size. Wyatt had gone with the blacksmith's boy to split kindling. The yard was still. Clayton stepped closer but left space between them. "I saw a flock of geese lift off the water this morning," he said. "They moved like they'd rehearsed it 100 times. Not one out of step." Georgia crossed her arms. "You didn't come here to talk about birds." "No," he said. "I came to ask if you'd have supper with me." She blinked. Where? My place. It's not much. Cabin's rough-sided and small. But I cook decent stew. She hesitated. I won't leave the children behind. I didn't ask you to. She studied his face. You think feeding me once is going to change what I've lived through? No, he said. I think sitting down beside someone without needing to guard your breath might feel like something new. Willa peeked out from behind the doorway, cheeks smudged with flour. Mama! Georgia turned. Go wash, sweetheart. We'll be heading out soon. They rode to the edge of town in a borrowed buckboard. Willa sat between them, quiet and curious, while Wyatt perched on the backboard with his legs swinging, eyes wide at the open stretch of land beyond the river bend. Clayton's cabin sat tucked against a grove of pine, neat and square. The porch sagged a little, but the roof held tight, and smoke curled from the chimney in a steady column. Inside, the room was warm with fire and the smell of venison, carrot, and thyme. A wooden table stood beneath a single lantern, and 2 places were already set with mismatched tinware. Willa climbed onto a stool near the hearth. Wyatt made a beeline for the shelf where a carved wooden horse stood, its legs chipped from age. You made this? Wyatt asked, turning it over. Clayton nodded. Whittled it when I was about your age. Georgia didn't sit until the stew was served. She watched the children first, waited to see if Willa would start picking at her food or Wyatt would find reason to leave the table. But both ate, slow and steady, eyes darting between bites. Clayton passed her a slice of cornbread without a word. The butter was soft enough to spread. You live alone out here? She asked. Always have. It doesn't bother you? He set his spoon down. Not until lately. Georgia looked down at her bowl. I wouldn't know what to do with quiet like this. Doesn't ask anything of you, he said. Just lets you be. After supper, Wyatt helped carry dishes to the basin, while Willa curled up on a sheepskin rug with a blanket draped over her legs. Georgia stood at the window, arms crossed, watching the light fade behind the trees. Clayton joined her, close enough she could feel the heat from his arm. You think you'll ever stop expecting things to fall apart? I don't know, she said, but sometimes I wonder what it would feel like if they didn't. He didn't answer right away. Then quiet. Maybe you'd sleep through a night without waking. She turned to him. And you think you could give me that? No, he said, but I'd share the waking. Georgia's chest tightened, sharp and unfamiliar. She looked at him full then, not cautious, not guarded, just a woman standing in the stillness with a man who hadn't once asked her to be smaller than she was. Willa stirred on the rug. Wyatt let out a yawn wide enough to crack his jaw. We should head back, she said, already reaching for their coats. I'll drive you, Clayton replied. As they rode back, the stars blinked out one by one above them. Georgia sat tucked close to the children, her hand resting beside Clayton's on the reins. She didn't speak, but when their fingers brushed, she didn't pull away. She didn't trust love, but she was beginning to believe in the man willing to wait beside her until she did. The first snow didn't fall, it whispered. A thin veil, barely enough to cling, but it settled quiet over rooftops and fence rails, softening the edges of Dry Creek. Georgia stood outside the boarding house with her shawl pulled tight and her thoughts caught somewhere between the sky and the ground. Willa knelt beside her, tracing a finger along the snow-dusted porch rail, while Wyatt packed his school slate and books into a canvas satchel Clayton had mended for him the week before. Georgia hadn't seen Clayton in 4 days, not since the supper at his cabin. Not because he'd disappeared, he hadn't, but because she'd needed time to sit with the way her chest had ached when he'd said he'd share the waking. She'd heard a lot of promises in her life. That one had felt different. She found him that afternoon at the far edge of town, standing in the half-frozen creek with a spade in hand. He was clearing a narrow channel, digging around a culvert that had clogged with leaves and silt. His coat was soaked at the hem, and his hat was dusted with snow. "You always work in weather like this?" she asked, stepping down the embankment. He straightened without surprise. "Water doesn't stop flowing just because it's cold." She stood a few feet from him, arms wrapped around herself. "I've been thinking. I hoped you would. I'm not good at letting people in," she said. "It's not that I don't feel things. It's that when I do, they get too loud." He nodded. "Loud's fine, long as you don't shut the door on it." She looked down at the run of water snaking beneath the ice. "The last thing I let in left without a word." "I don't leave quiet," he said. "If I go, you'll know why." Georgia took a step closer. "I don't want you to go." Clayton set the spade aside, his breath visible between them. "Then say it." "I want you here," she said. "With us." He didn't reach for her. He waited. "I don't want to be careful around you anymore," she said. "And I don't want my children to grow up thinking caution is the same as safety." Clayton's eyes didn't waver. "Then let's build something steadier." They walked back together, not hand in hand, but close enough their coats brushed. At her door she paused. "Come in," she said. "If you mean to stay, then come inside." He stepped through without hesitation. That night, Georgia told Willa and Wyatt gently, simply, that Mr. Archer would be spending more time with them, not as a visitor, but as part of their days. Willa asked if that meant he'd help with winter stories before bed. Wyatt asked if he'd teach him how to set a rabbit trap. Clayton answered them both without pause. They began fitting into each other's patterns. He moved his tools into the shed behind the house and began rising early to milk the neighbor's cow in exchange for cream. Georgia shared her ledger so he could help balance the accounts. The children adjusted faster than she did, but Georgia didn't rush herself. When she reached for his hand one morning without thinking, his fingers closed around hers like they'd been waiting. The schoolteacher offered to marry them on a Sunday. It was a simple ceremony in the loft of the livery barn, beneath a pine needle garland and a sky that stayed clear long enough to see the sun. Willa dropped dried petals from a tin pail. Wyatt stood at Clayton's side with his chin high and steady. Georgia wore a dress she'd sewn from the canvas bolt Clayton once brought her, softened with washing and trimmed with a ribbon she'd kept since Missouri. She looked up at him and didn't feel like she was stepping off a cliff. She felt like she'd found solid ground. After the words were spoken and the town folk had clapped and cheered, Georgia leaned in close to his ear. "I never thought I'd want to start again," she said. Clayton touched her cheek. "Then let's not start again. Let's just keep going." That winter they moved into the cabin, all four of them. Georgia's sewing table took the space nearest the window. Willa kept her button tin beneath the bed. Wyatt built a chicken coop with Clayton, hammering nails too long but proud all the same. Georgia laughed more. She still had days where her shoulders stayed tight and her voice came out clipped, but Clayton never asked her to be anything she wasn't. By spring, the creek ran high with meltwater, and the first shoots of green pushed through the thawed earth. Georgia woke one morning to the smell of coffee and biscuits, and the sound of Clayton's voice reading aloud to Willa from a book she couldn't yet finish on her own. She stood in the doorway for a long time, watching him sit cross-legged on the rug, the girl curled against his side, her thumb tucked beneath her chin. Georgia didn't feel like she'd survived something anymore. She felt like she'd arrived. And there, in that house of pine and stitched cloth, with the man who had waited without asking, the boy growing into his boots, and the girl who now slept without flinching, Georgia Calloway Archer finally found what she'd never dared to name: peace and love, and a life that held.